Hi, this is Bits and Pieces, the official podcast of Component Supply. I'm Kristin.
And I'm Mark.
And today I get to talk to Mark about, I get to talk to you with Mark, I guess, about going
Talk at me.
I'll talk at you, about going to MPP East, which was in Quincy, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. And last time there was an MPP event, Mark got to go.
In Mountain View, California.
In Mountain View, you went solo.
Yes.
And you did not do a podcast episode on it.
There was probably more important things to talk about, and you probably bumped my idea to something more pressing.
More pressing. Yeah. I think we just didn't think about it, to be honest with you. But I do like the idea of going to conferences, going to trade shows, and then bringing back something we learned or conversations we heard or things we saw, and kind of see if what we observed at these conferences matches with what you guys are seeing in the industry. I think a lot of times the conferences and trade shows are a great way to see kind of the new technology, good way to see kind of some of the challenges that people are having in the industry and work together to remedy some of those issues. So I like that. I like that I can sit next to friends who are competitors and people that I don't know or I've never met before. They're in some other segment of the industry that I'm not familiar with. So I get to learn, collaborate, kind of has all the facets that I love. And I just come home really inspired and excited. And so I was going to just kind of take Mark through the themes that I saw, which I think some of them are
very
similar themes to what you heard at MPP West. And so it seems to be some trends in the industry. So I want to kind of just summarize some of those and see what your take is on some of these. And of course, like we've already had some of these conversations before, but we really do want to bring them to some of our listeners and hear your feedback. So you can always email us or schedule a call. I'd love to hear about some of the themes and challenges that you're seeing. One of the ones that I heard, I thought this was an interesting perspective, is there was a lot of conversation on dual sourcing. People were bringing that up a lot, and I haven't heard as much about that. People have been a little bit more protective about wanting to, they want to be the primary or the only source. And so I heard a little bit, it was like kind of a, are we being more collaborative? I like this. But one of the things that someone said was that the end users, the engineers, the R&D teams should be stress testing their suppliers. And initially I thought, I don't like that word. That seems mean. Like, can you imagine if you just came to work and were like, I'm going to stress test Kristin? I mean, you already kind of do that every day.
That sounds like Tuesday.
But but it really is this idea, I think, of really just striving for a more open communication. And it's not really about being like, let's throw this at them without telling them anything. Although some of you do that, you do. Change the spec and expect the price to stay the same, things like that.
Right.
But I think more about like what happens when our demand changes. How quickly can you pivot if there is a design change? What if our product isn't doing what we want it to do and our demand decreases? What does a redesign cycle look like for you? So having some of those early conversations, and so having that, and I think what we like about this is obviously we talk about this like on every episode. We love the early conversation, and it's more about just early like communication of the expectations that you would have, and like knowing your suppliers really well. Like you talk about that a lot. You talk about it from our perspective because we're buying from a lot of different manufacturers, and something that's really important to you for our purchasing team is you need to know your supplier.
It's one of the core values of Component Supply is to be a good customer. Not obviously we want to be a good supplier.
Right.
We want to be a good employer, but also the third is to be a good customer. This means for us, it means we pay our bills early, and it means we understand how our vendors work. Not every company runs the same. They even units of measure, something as basic as that. Certain groups that work in units, eaches. Some groups that work in feet. Some groups that work in pounds. Some people work in linear yard,
right, depending on the material.
So for us, we can sit here and say, well, we work in eaches, or we work in feet, or whatever that is, and we can kind of draw a line. I don't want Component Supply to be like that. I want them to understand what our vendors do and work with them. Yeah. And I think this is where, when it talk about stress test, I like that term, and at the same time, the motive is very important, right? Like, are you going through a stress test with your supplier, with your vendor, with Component Supply to find out where they break, what they can't do, or are you doing it to strengthen your relationship. If you're doing it for simply to find out what their weaknesses are, whatever, you're really doing it for the wrong reason.
Well, and it's something that can be solved with early conversations, right? Like, and you've talked about, just getting to know the supplier and knowing, like, hey, their lead time might be this, and we just need to know that. We need to adjust for that in our plan. They're a good supplier. We can build around that versus being like sending them a purchase order and expecting it in a week. That's not a fair stress test, I would say.
Correct.
It's better to kind of know, do you have an expedite option, for example, or something like that, versus just changing your expectations
and
on
also
the fly.
How a supplier like Component Supply will respond to a situation. Some of the things you said that they brought up was what happens if the conversation of saying, hey, what happens if our demand goes up 40%? But then also, like, what happens if our demand decreases 30%? How do we respond? How does your supplier respond to both of those?
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got the sides where everybody wants to sell more. There's a point. What happens if it goes up 40%? What happens if it triples? Those are two different conversations. But then there is the conversation of, like, what happens if we wind up in a situation, not even just let's just say a company decides to restructure or move or something, and they're like, we want to pull this back or push. What is your relationship like with your supplier? How will they respond or react to that?
Yeah.
These are the purposes behind the stress test and those conversations with your suppliers.
Well, and we have, like, the cowboy engineer principle. We have new stickers. Super excited about our cowboy engineer stickers. So you can find them at your next trade show that Component Supply is exhibiting at. But in terms of, like, you talk about cowboy engineers, you kind of introduced this topic to me when I was new in the industry. The cowboy engineer is the one that's designing smaller. They're stretching it further. They're finding failure points.
Heating it up fast more than they're supposed to.
Yes.
They're testing the limits.
The pressure limits. Yeah. They're testing the limits. They're testing failure points, but it's with intentionality to know where it's going to break. Obviously, we don't want it to break in the patient. We want it to break before then. And I think there's something about understanding where it breaks that really matters, but not just from a cowboy engineering perspective, but with your supplier. Like, there is a point, not every supplier can be everything to everyone at all times. So knowing, I hate to say where it breaks, but it's really the truth. Like, at some point, that supplier can't meet your needs, whether that's in the R&D phase, their lead time's too long, whether it's production phase, they can't scale. So kind of knowing, having the relationship with the supplier, and then, like they said, dual sourcing. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Have second-tiered supplier, tertiary suppliers. That's important because something could happen.
Well, I think this is when you talk about the relationship, right? This is where it goes both ways. As a supplier, if a customer or supplier has gone through this process of, call it stress testing, or let's just call it, like, the higher level, has truly built a relationship, right? Then what happens is there is a level of trust and honesty that takes place.
Yeah.
And when you get a print, when you get a question in this, through this, the vulnerability as a supplier to say, hey, that's not really, like, I probably can do that, but honestly, like, there's a better, for that particular situation, for this particular, capable, whatever it is, even have enough trust with your customer to say, I don't want to turn down my business to a competitor, but so-and-so really is good at that.
Yeah.
And then know that while in that moment it may hurt your business, if you can build the relationship on both sides, your customer will benefit because they're going to get what they need really from someone who's really good at it.
Yeah.
And the truth is, if you have that relationship and then you add that capability later, you've got a relationship with the customer. They'll probably move it back to you. But the point was to maintain the relationship long term. Yeah. And so that level of trust, that level of vulnerability, if you can have that with your customer or supplier, it then opens all those conversations, right? Like, I'm looking for a secondary supplier. And, I would like that if we could build those relationships with customers where they would call us and say, hey, we're looking for a secondary. We know we get this from you, but it is vulnerable.
Yeah.
Where we could say, well, here's 3 other people
Yeah.
that do it. You know, that we have that kind of level of trust
Yeah.
with our customers, and then consequently, they have enough freedom to say, hey, we're worried that we're going to move, we're going to do something, and our volumes are going to go down. Can we work through a 6-month process where we slow things down? This is what it looks like. These are the kind of conversations that you can't just have. You can't just automatically have. You've got to build that in. And some of that is just having early conversations of kind of the what if. How would you respond if? Like, can I get away with this?
Yeah.
And seeing if you can build that over time.
Yeah.
I love our suppliers who I have cell phone numbers for. I mean, that's what you're looking for, is to build that. And it takes time, and it takes conversations, over a protracted period of time to build that.
Yeah.
But that's the goal.
Yeah.
And I think that's the purpose of all of these things.
Yeah. So I heard the stress test, and for me that kind of has like this negative connotation. Right. So, but it is the idea of like, in points of stress, maybe, how are you going to react? What is the expectation going to be? What kind of backup plans do we have? So that was kind of, we kept hearing over and over again in the panel, dual sourcing, don't put all your eggs in one basket, have lots of people you can rely on. And OEMs, like, widen your ASL, like your approved supplier list should have more than one supplier on it for the components that you're working with. It's just healthier business for you. Okay, the next is we've done this on the podcast before, and it's a conversation that it's a little trendy, I think, to talk about good, fast, cheap. Which one's more important? Which one's valuable? And I think about it a lot. I think about where component supply is in the space and what our values are. I think no one likes to hear the word cheap in the medical device industry, right? Like that kind of has a connotation of being poorly made, even though we've made good
cheap
or
is
quality.
Almost like intentionally poor quality.
Yes.
That's the
versus more what I think we're meaning is it's not maybe exact to spec, not because it's sloppy, but because of DFM or because of a limited capability, not because your supplier's trying to screw you, honestly, right? Like that's not the point. But I walked away with it kind of having a different perspective this time, and I think it came off the heels of that first conversation. So I'm already in the we need to be talking more, but I came away with it thinking it's less about you have to pick 2. That's a fun game, right? Good, fast, cheap, pick 2.
Right.
But really, I think there is always a balance between those 3, and I think this is where having conversations with suppliers early is so important. I'm sure there are some terrible suppliers out there in one or more of those facets. That's probably true. I'm thankful to not really have that experience with many, if any. But when we're thinking about a trade-off, it's more about how that supplier is built, right? I know we have suppliers, and I'm going to expect that their lead time, in general, my expectation is their lead time's 8 weeks, and I can adjust my planning to that. But I know it's going to be quality. I know it's going to be a fair price. I'm going to build my processes into play knowing that lead time. Now, component supply, you've said, we always focus primarily on the good and the fast. We might not be the cheapest option all of the time. And
well, this is where you said balancing, I look at and it's not even by company or customer, right? It can even be by project.
Yes.
So the same company can have a project that says, okay, for me, I'm gonna place them in order. So there's always an order, right?
Yeah,
and
that's a good way
even
to
if you look at all 3 of them, even if you were to say pick 2, it's the reality is what happens is one always comes to the top.
Yeah.
So
and you're never eliminating one.
You're
completely.
never eliminating one because nobody ever says I don't care what it costs.
Agree to disagree. I have had people say that, and that's the best.
I don't think they really mean it because if you hand them something,
of course.
I had I was in a sales meeting one time. This is a deviation.
No, I love it.
But I wasn't the one that was selling. I was writing with a manufacturer.
Okay.
And in the process, the manufacturer said, we can't do this. And this was good. I was early in my career, and I remember the customer looking across the desk and saying, okay, when you say you can't do it, like if I gave you $1 million, could you do it?
Yes.
And I saw the wheels turning in the guy, in the rep I was riding with head, but it really spoke to me like, okay, all right, well, because I immediately thought like, for $1 million, I can probably do it.
Well, and I think you've said that before. Like you look at a drawing, you're like, no, and we'll be like, well, they said they're flexible in price, and you're like, oh, we'll figure it out. we'll see if we can make it work.
But what happens is, in that list, right? So when I say, generally, nobody ever says, I don't care what it costs.
Yeah.
Like the reality is, if we come back with $1 million, I could probably do it, but they're going to care. Mm-hmm. So in that list, one of them is always going to rise to the top. Yeah. If they basically say, okay, this is like speed and quality is important to me. In that process, it's like, okay, well, I can get it to you fast, but the reality is like it's going to take a little more time if I've got to make the tooling. If you can deal with these with kind of loosening your tolerances here, that's where the decision comes in and says, okay, you know what? Time is more important to me than the quality. So I'm willing to give up, if you will, good. Take a little bit off because I know you're going to have to make some tooling because I need it fast. Versus saying, you know what? Actually, I'm okay. I'll take a little. You can take an extra week to make the right tooling because quality or good is actually more important than time at that point. So there's always it's like you just simply rank them 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah. And I think even knowing that about your vendors is correct. Like, we're going to always compose supplies assuming a quick lead time. That's our thing, right? We're going to be fast. And so within that, like we've embedded this, we've considered that in the pricing. Mm-hmm. We've considered like this standard, it's going to be a 1 week lead time. It's going to be a 2 week lead time. And that's worth something. But
yes,
that's why it's an important conversation. You're like, well, we can have this ramp up period, or we don't need this right away. And we've been told that feedback. You guys, they were like, we found it somewhere cheaper, and we really didn't need your fast lead time this time.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, I wish I would have known. Like that's our go-to is that fast lead time. But we want to work with you.
Well, this is where our quoting becomes. Like I said, our natural tendency is to think, okay, they need 30,000 feet, and we're going to just price it in kind of our. But the truth is, they didn't really need that in 3 weeks. Everybody else was 8 weeks, 6, whatever that was. And had we gone in and said, okay, well, let's put our time factor back. In other words, let's put the time. The time can go lower than. So now all of a sudden we would have priced that very differently.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we're trying to anticipate needs the best that we can. Sometimes, our end users aren't always the easiest to talk to. We try to get the information, but a lot of times we're anticipating. We mostly service, or mostly our projects typically start in the R&D phase. That's because of some of just how component supply is built with the no MOQ thing and like the low shop minimums when it goes custom. That's kind of how we're built. So we're anticipating, and most of you say, I needed this yesterday. When do you need this? I needed it yesterday. We hear that more than we hear the cost isn't an option thing. We'd like to hear both of those together. But really that's where our focus is. But if the priorities are changing and you're willing to have the conversation, then we would like to try and align our priorities with you on a project by project basis.
It's a mistake for us to make that assumption. Like I can admit that. When we make the assumption,
but you can't have it all. Like we want to quote faster,
right?
So we have to make some assumptions in order to quote quickly, and then we do sometimes get the follow up on why that didn't work, and that's when we hear the feedback. Yeah. Now I will say it's been very rare for us to get the feedback of your lead time was too fast, but it has happened a couple of times. Like. Your price was an indicator of your short lead time. The lead time wasn't important to us this time. It's customers bought from us before.
Right.
And needed the lead time. So even for the same customer, different project didn't have the same priority level. So like you said, project by project basis, not just supplier customer relationship kind of conversation, but really like what is that project? What is that sourcing team looking like? Okay, the next theme I liked, I think this was the scaling catheter production theme panel, and I thought it was really well done. I really enjoyed the conversation at some point revolved around this kind of the lack of planning or the error of not planning for this U-shaped curve that happens when you're going from kind of a prototype to production phase. Like you're getting a certain amount of yield, you have certain efficiencies, then you start to grow and scale, and people assume it's going to be this linear line, but instead it's actually a U-shape. You lose a little bit of productivity for a little while you're dealing with validation, the extra quality pieces, things like that, and people don't plan for that, and that busts their timeline. So I loved the call to action to really plan for that. That was encouraging to me too. And really, again, going back to transparency with suppliers, when you're going to scale, that 1 week lead time might not apply to your 100,000 parts. Right?
Well, yeah.
There's the setup is different. The operators and number of operators are different. You might be adding lines occasionally. When you're starting to scale a production, there are changes that are made in that adjustment period, whether that's you're adding lines, you're adding operators, you're adding quality requirements, inline measuring systems are in play. All of that takes place. And so there should be an expectation when you're scaling that it's not going to scale in a linear fashion. There might be some initial delays. For us, that's the ramp up program that we have. You know, when someone wants to discuss what scaling looks like at Component Supply, we try to give them a really realistic expectation, I think, of what the prototype quantities look like in those time frames, and they want to move to this. What's that scaling? What's that ramp up time frame?
That just the practical side of, you know, when we help we go through a process and something is designed and it's even designed for scale. That doesn't mean in the beginning it's produced at scale. So for example, when they say, okay, well, this is what we've designed it around, this is what we've dealt with from tolerances and deviations, and so now we're gonna produce it, and they want 100 pieces to test. Well, we're not going to produce that the same way, depending on how it's done and on all the different processes. But let's say it's multiple processes. We would not produce that the same way that we would, say, 10,000 or 50,000.
Sure.
So what happens is they order 100, they order 1,000, they order 1,000 a couple of times, and now all of a sudden, all right, that's it. Now let's go from 1,000 to 5,000 and what happens is in this process, now all of a sudden we say, okay, if that's the case, we can't make 50,000 in this process. We can do certain things. Let's say we could do some grinding. We can do certain things the same way, but some of the other processes, we need to make tooling that can handle a much higher quantity. Yeah. Which means you have to kind of back up and be like, okay, for example, I have to load one at a time into this thing, okay? And so now we're going to back up and figure out how to do that. But if I can slow down, so in other words, I can dip in my production. I can go from a fact where we were doing, 1,000 a day or whatever. I'm just going to make up some numbers, 1,000 a day, and I can back up and say, okay, let's figure out how to do 200 a day, but figure out a method to do it where I can have a robot. Pull that off.
Mark, you love a robot.
Well, I'm just saying, at that point, I might back up, and I might have an operator sit there and do that. It'd be super slow. But now I can put automation in place. Well, that dip took place for a purpose, and then it ran. That is how that happens, and it happens on, I don't want to say every project, but a lot of projects. And planning for that, and this is, we have a saying here at Component Supply. I didn't come up with it. One of our operators, Mike, came up with it. It doesn't came up with it. But he's always says, a plan is something to deviate from. Having a plan is good, even if it's a straight line. But you have to understand that straight line is something to deviate from. Something will happen, something will come up, and you'll need to deviate from it.
That's why there is such a thing as a plan B.
Well, but this idea of planning, understanding, like, I drew my straight line, I need to somewhere along the line, I need to consider this ahead of time. Even if that U shape is wrong, it's closer to something that's right. You're still going to deviate from it. But it's closer.
You're anticipating more of the worst case scenario. Yeah. No, it's good. There was some talk about automation on some of the panels, and it was really good. We don't really have time to dive into that today, but it was a good conversation. Okay, lastly, we'll move to women in medtech, because that's a little bit different, right? A lot of the conversations around these processing panels is related to materials, related to a technology or capability. This was a little different. I was honored to be asked to be on this inaugural panel. I didn't know what to expect at first. I actually was a little hesitant because I think I got nervous that it would either be some kind of griping session, which it was not, or I honestly sometimes just want that to be, I just want my work to stand for itself. I don't want to be put in a category of something other than like good old-fashioned meritocracy. I mean, that's just the truth. But I think it was enlightening to me to get to talk individually and in small groups with several of the women in our industry to realize where some flaws are still, to experience some of those, to realize that my experiences might sometimes be an exception rather than the norm. I've had really positive experiences for the most part as a woman in medtech, both internally at Component Supply and just in general. And so it was good to have, there was a like a networking event for some of the women the day before, and then we had this panel and just those conversations. I do think a lot of what was said really does apply to anybody in any place in their career. We talked a lot about the kind of the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. Like, you can mentor anybody, give them good advice, things like that, take them alongside and show them how it's done. But especially in larger organizations, like, I don't know how much of this has applied at Component Supply, because we get to, our upper management gets to see everybody all the time. But the idea of people in those leadership positions really taking sponsorship, like looking to upper management and being like, you need to pay attention to this person. This would, like, helping that person get a seat at the table. I thought that was a really interesting conversation. I can see that being really important in a larger organization, but something also to be mindful of here, even as we're growing and scaling. So I appreciated that. I appreciated there was some transparency just about the difficulty that women have as mothers. And obviously, like, I've experienced that. But again, I'm on the benefit of being in a smaller organization that has probably more flexibility than what larger ones do. And just that the idea of, like, truly balancing motherhood with a career. And men make it a big adjustment too when a baby is brought into the world, but it's certainly not the same, right? And I think kind of recognizing that, not being ashamed to say that out loud, was important. I think part of the conversation, and I think we experienced a lot of this, is when I had my third child a few years ago, we had to have a lot of conversation, because I started at Component Supply when my older kids were small, but they weren't newborns. And so I think my takeaway from a lot of that was employers not assuming the desires of the mother, right? Like, assuming that she won't want to come back to work, assuming that she's going to quit, assuming that her job's not important to her, or other things like that. I think really having the open communication and, like, seeing her, and you talk about this and you implement this at Component Supply, like, we've hired humans with lives and souls and hopes and dreams. That was one of the things I said at the panel. And so, we were talking specifically about motherhood, but I think we've seen situations where our employees are, like, the main caretakers for their aging parents. Like, there are other reasons. There are other seasons of vulnerability, I think, in a life. And I think becoming a mother, or, like, adding to your family, growing your family, that's along those lines for sure. And, like, the biggest way that I can think of. But there are other ones. And so I think, like, management having really open and transparent conversations, like, that's something that we have easily in a small company. I think it's something to really challenge the larger organizations on, is, like, not just seeing your people as a number, seeing the women who are having new babies, like, celebrating that with them. I think there is good celebration happening, not making assumptions about their plans after, but also, like, checking in with those plans, because life changes. I mean, there have been babies in NICUs, right? There have been complicated procedures. There have been the story can change pretty rapidly. So I think keeping those communication lines open is really important. And I think not seeing motherhood as a crutch was something that, or not a crutch, a flaw, or a negative in some ways. Like, it's exciting, but oh, she has a baby. Like, she's not going to be as attentive, or she's not. I would say, like, having a baby helped me to really see my priorities in a different light. Like, I ended up, I think I was doing a lot of things that a lot of other people could do, and I was able to more focus on the things that only I can do and only I can do well, because I had limited time. I had limited energy for a season. Sometimes that season was yesterday, actually. Like, occasionally we dip. There's also a curve.
There's a curve there, yeah.
With motherhood. But I really did appreciate just the opportunity to get to discuss. I don't know how many opportunities there are for a bunch of women to talk about, like, some of the challenges in their workspaces. But,
I listened to this, and I think, okay, well, we were talking not long ago about the relationship between the supplier and the customer, and the vulnerability to talk about these things. And this is, I think, if you kind of just go down to the core, there's still that has to exist between an employee and their employer. Yeah. And again, that vulnerability goes both ways. Yeah. I agree. If that relationship doesn't exist, those conversations aren't going to happen. Yeah. And it can't, it is a, people use the word culture. I think there's a difference between culture and environment. But the reality is, if that doesn't exist, those conversations won't ever happen, because there's not going to be the vulnerability, because there's not the trust on both sides, from the employer looking at an employee or an employee looking at their employer. And so that it has to start with that basis, that there has to be some relationship that has a foundation of security and trust. So that there can be vulnerability in the conversation. Because I guarantee you, just mentioning some of these things, there's an HR attorney somewhere that's like cringing over everything that we're saying. But the reality is, like, we're not trying to get in the middle of asking questions that are inappropriate. Right. We're talking about building a plan. Yeah, and there was a plan in the beginning, and the plan deviated. The plan deviated, and now there's kind of like a new plan. Yeah. And what does that plan look like? Because did goals change, or did they just temporarily shift on both sides? And so these are the conversations that probably don't take place. Yeah. But in order for them to take place, there has to be that relationship. And if a company doesn't build that to begin with, that and I'm not saying it's all on the manager or the management of the company. They bear responsibility, but the employee bears responsibility as well from that relationship. Yeah. And if we're all looking for good experiences in the end, that has to happen on both sides. Yeah.
No, I agree. I do sometimes wonder if some of what naturally happens, like in the course of conversations and like mentorship, does shift in these more personal conversations. So, for example, one of the things I said was that, I don't think I said your name, but I'll say it now. I didn't say on the panel that Mark, Component Supply, gave me decision-making power before I was fully ready for it. Like, I wrote our quality system. I knew nothing about quality management systems at all. Like, bought the standard, interviewed all of our employees about what they did, and wrote this system. I knew nothing, and I wasn't unsupported. It's just I had the freedom to do this thing and to figure it out, knowing I had support, but I wasn't micromanaged. And I wonder if management teams that have that same mentality, that give their people decision-making power early, that let them have some creative freedom in some of their processes without getting into a nonconformity kind of situation, but just creative freedom in some ways, able to contribute meaningfully before they're fully ready. I wonder if those are the same management teams that are more likely to have these really positive conversations in the more vulnerable life phases. They're in the practice of giving freedom, and checking in without micromanaging everything. I wonder if they're the ones that are having the most healthy conversations with people who are taking care of aging parents or sick children or recovering from coming back from maternity leave, and evaluating how they're doing. So I think there's probably a more general corporate health conversation that can be had. This was just a specific part of it.
Yes, there are indicators there that would, but for sure, so in those situations, you've got to, we trusted you to do that. That us, me trusting you in that, for that project, in essence, opened up the ability for you to see how I would respond in moments where things didn't turn out perfect.
Right.
Which then allowed you to trust me.
Yeah, like, are you condescended to when you make a mistake?
Right.
No. Like, are you criticized? Are you told you're stupid? Are you asked, how could you think that? Like, no.
Right.
So I'm not going to be as nervous to approach, and I hope my people aren't either when they have like a need or they're in a season of life that's tricky. So I love that. One thing I will just, this is way too long already. This is not bits and pieces. This is saga. But I do want to say one important thing, and we did have someone at the end of the panel address sort of the kind of inappropriate behaviors that can happen, less so on like a trade show floor, more so in those kind of after hour events. And unfortunately, those are the events where lots of networking happens, lots of relationships are built over time. But there are also situations in which men occasionally behave inappropriately, right? And it's an uncomfortable conversation. It's a conversation I think a lot of times women kind of freeze because they're just like shocked that this is happening. But I think it's something to be aware of. And I think like you haven't always been aware of things that are going on. I don't usually like hang out in those venues, so I haven't had a lot of those experiences. But my conversations with the women at MPP were, these things are less frequent. We're being treated better. We'd like to thank the women who came ahead of us and have given us this culture in this industry that's largely wonderful. But we still have work to do. And the charge to her was really for the men to, if you are not a man who's kind of crossed the lines in those venues, be aware that it's happening and say something when you see something that's off-putting.
Well, that's what you did. We talked about this, and honestly, it was surprising to me. But I think some of that is I don't know to even look for it.
Yeah.
I don't. So because of all the times I've spent in these events, I've never witnessed this. But it makes me wonder: did I not witness it, or was I just not even paying attention? And so I think the charge for and this is my take on it, but we're talking about the overwhelming minority of men, and I'm hoping that this statement is true, that the overwhelming majority of men are not like this, would not behave in this manner. And so my charge to us is the overwhelming majority is that pay attention, and if we pay attention first, and if we recognize it, then act on it. Even if it costs you business. If it's somebody that you work with, call it out. Call it out in public, but call it out. That's our responsibility.
It's a good charge. And one of the things that really was encouraging about MPP is there were a couple groups of men that came at like the networking event at the end of MPP and were like, hey, we've just been like oblivious, or we haven't been paying attention, but like that's our commitment. We're going to be paying attention now. And I just thought that was such a encouragement to me in an industry that I dearly love, that it can only get better, right? Like we have people that are paying attention. We have advocates that are watching, and so I'm encouraged by that. And overall, MPP was a great event. I mean, I really did feel encouraged. I think it brought, like you, I think my eyes were open to some of the ways we still need to improve in that realm. But I just found really great connections. I'm like the worst businesswoman. I'm like, not just business, but like personal. But it's really how I felt. Like I felt like I came away with new friends, and like even if we're more medical device, like our industry, like our connection to the industry is not like perfectly aligned. We have a good connection. Things that I am like, I have referrals in mind for that person, or she's having a baby. Like I know I want to make sure I send her something. Like I just think we could all use those little boosts, and so I just walked away.
Like when you get your Florida State onesie.
Oh my goodness, yes. One of our vendors, I'm a huge Gator fan, and one of my vendors is a huge Florida State Seminole fan, and he did send me a Florida State Seminole onesie, and I appreciate it, even though it was a little hateful. So anyways, we're going to cut off. Thank you for listening. I know this was a long one. I'd love to hear any of your comments, feedbacks on MPP or any other conferences that you've been to, anything that you're noticing. We'd love to be aware of them and see what we can do to contribute to the conversation. So thank you, and go change the world.